Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. The topic of this webinar is Lessons Learned from Low-Income Energy Efficiency Programs, and this is part of a Low-Income Solar series, part 1. We have part 2 next week. This webinar is a presentation of the Sustainable Solar Education Project. This project is managed by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and supported by the U.S. Department of Energy's Sunshot Initiative. We have an excellent guest speaker with us today, and before I pass it over to him, I'm going to turn this over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he's going to tell us a bit more about the topic for today's webinar, and he will be introducing our guest speaker as well. Before I do that, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants are in listen-only mode. You have a couple options for joining the audio portion of this webinar. You can join using your telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. We're going to save about 15 minutes for a Q&A. So we'll be reading through your questions as they come in. Type your question in when you think of it. Don't wait till the very end, and that increases your chance that we will get to your question. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous webinars from the Clean Energy States Alliance and from the Sustainable Solar Education Project. Those are on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon.
Hey, thank you very much, Samantha. Before I introduce our speaker, let me tell you a couple things about the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're a national organization of public agencies working together to advance clean energy, especially in the realm of electricity generation. We have members in 17 states, and you can see most of their logos on this website. And if we go to the next slide, one of the things we do is we produce webinars on a wide range of topics, and it so happens over the next couple of weeks we have an unusually large number of good ones coming up, and you can see the list here. Everything from the interactions between wildlife and wind turbines to solar plus storage projects to the Massachusetts' new solar carve-out program. You could sign up for any of these by going to our website at cesa.org/webinars. And if we go to the next slide, this particular webinar today is being organized as part of CESA's Sustainable Solar Education Project. As Samantha said, this is a DOE-funded effort to provide information to states and to other interested stakeholders on two key topics related to solar. One, how to ensure that the benefits of solar accrue to low and moderate income households, and how to ensure that solar electricity remains being consumer friendly with high consumer protection standards. And we will be doing other webinars on this topic. We have a range of publications that have come out in recent months. We have a monthly mailing list of a newsletter that talks about everything going on around the country related to low-income solar and solar consumer protection. So, excuse me. So you can sign up for that mailing. So with that, let's turn to the topic today. There is a lot of interest on the part of states in trying to look at how to reach low-income communities, low-income households with solar energy. Well, one place we could look for information and ideas is to the energy efficiency realm, where there is extensive experience on trying to reach the low and moderate income market with energy efficiency measures. And we are fortunate today to have as our speaker to tell us what folks in the energy efficiency realm know about that market and ways to reach them. Ian Hoffman, who is the Senior Scientist and Engineering Associate in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And in his role there, he analyzes energy efficiency policies and programs, and that includes managing a national database of utility energy efficiency programs. He's published reports, he's provided technical assistance on energy efficiency for low and moderate income households. He holds a master's degree in energy and resources from the University of California at Berkeley. And as Samantha said, Ian is going to give his presentation and we'll have time for Q&A. And if you have questions, type them in as you think about them. So let me turn it over to Ian.
Okay, it's a pleasure talking to you today. Before we get started, I want to emphasize that we're a national laboratory. We work for you, and I welcome my colleague who will be giving a presentation next week. We welcome any follow-up questions that you have via the contact information that you'll find at the end of these slides. So we're going to try and cover a lot of ground. We're going to draw upon some data from the census, from the Energy Information Administration, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, some program evaluations, and some of our own data collection at LBNL. And we're going to talk first about defining the low and moderate income population. We're going to talk some about income eligibility thresholds. We're going to talk about geography and demographics and what kind of the housing stock looks like. We're going to discuss some of the standard approaches to low-income energy efficiency that we see that are typical around the country, and some of the challenges that folks have encountered, as well as some of the more recent responses to those challenges. And lastly, we'll take any questions you have. So this question of whether a household is low or moderate income, it really depends. The first thing to realize is that there is no set national definition of low or moderate income. Instead, there are lots of different definitions. The term middle America or middle class gets tossed around a lot, and it's, from certain perspectives, it's both frustratingly and from other perspectives, it's conveniently vague. There are lots of rules and definitions of who is low and moderate income, and it's very contextual. It matters where a household is. Some states use unique income thresholds for defining low income. And it also depends what kind of initiative we're talking about and how the eligibility guidelines are applied, including at what geographic resolution households are screened. And you can see some examples here. For most energy efficiency purposes, including most utility low-income energy efficiency programs, and the work that's funded by the Federal Weatherization Assistance Program, or WAP, low income is defined as 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. So these are uniform, they're applied nationally, and they're keyed to household size. But a few states, such as New York, try to bring more locational differences in the cost of living to bear. And so you end up with these results where, for some of these states that have their own guidelines, a household that's living at the national median of $56,000 a year may be considered eligible for low-income energy efficiency services in Manhattan, but not in the rural Midwest. Just for the purposes of this presentation and the sake of simplicity, we're going to treat the eligibility threshold for low-income energy efficiency as 200% of the FPL, and for moderate income as 300% of the federal poverty level. So what I want to emphasize here is that these different definitions produce some very real differences in the energy impacts of either an energy efficiency or plausibly a renewable energy initiative. Here, this is some work that we did for DOE, where we were looking at the relative savings potential across different definitions of low and moderate income. And these savings estimates are based upon evaluated savings from weatherizations or retrofits of houses, both single family units, mobile homes, small and large multifamily, in multiple combinations and housing, and also the kind of heating. Is it fuel, oil, gas, electricity, or as we kind of see in a number of northeastern and western states. So you'll see that in addition to the national application of the various percentages of the federal poverty guidelines, we're also looking at applying those income screens and others for specific geographies. And so there's median area income, and we were also looking, we looked at this, at applying these guidelines at a national level, at state levels, down to the census tract. And so, again, why do we go to those trouble? We wanted to see the effect of changing the different methods of income screening and what kinds of savings you might get as you shift those definitions around. And what you can see is, as you apply these definitions on a narrower and narrower geographic basis, as opposed to screening folks individually by income, that you tend to get more and more limited energy impacts. And this is because you're focusing increasingly on a fairly constrained number of places where low and moderate income households are concentrated. So you can do that and get some efficiencies in service delivery, but it does impact your energy energy savings. So there's good and bad news here. I mean, the good news is that the nation actually has fairly few pockets of really profound poverty, and there is some economic segregation, but and this is kind of the good news, which is, I mean, this is a little bit of a some bad news, which is low and moderate income households are widely distributed. That wide distribution can pose some limitations on the economies of scale in delivering energy efficiency or renewables to these households to address what have you, energy poverty or energy housing or energy conditions or emissions. So next, let's look at where regionally we tend to see the most energy impacts, at least from energy efficiency efforts. And in terms of both electricity and associated emissions, the South alone accounts for more than half of the potential. Now, these assumptions are based upon some estimation of absolute savings, but the relative or percentage share for each region should be about right. So we're going to see somewhat lower percentages in the West and Midwest, but what you notice is kind of not surprisingly, where you see the greatest savings potential is where you have a coincidence between hot, humid, or even somewhat moderate climate, where you have heavy reliance upon electricity for AC and heating, and where you have these fairly elevated levels generally for low and medium moderate income households. So let's start kind of to drill into the nature of, we're going to mostly look at low income households, and these account for, a third of the total households in the United States. If we add in moderate income households, that share goes to half of the households in the country. And again, kind of as we referred to in the previous slide, the largest numbers of low-income households are in these moderate and hot and humid climates in the South, and then also in kind of a narrow band of cold climate that runs, kind of from Utah and Colorado out west, across the middle of the country, and then stretching up through the Ohio and Tennessee valleys into the Northeast, all the way up towards, but not including Maine. So in racial or ethnic terms, low-income households are slightly more diverse than the U.S. population as a whole. More than half of low-income households are Caucasian. Nationally, that value would be 2/3. Most of the remaining low-income households are evenly split between Black and non-Hispanic white households. The prevalence of Hispanic households in the low-income population is the same as for all households nationally. African Americans count for just slightly more low-income households than for the full population. And so, we do want to, looking at these demographics and structures and kind of the nature of income really has some bearing on service delivery and program impacts. And I'll explain a little more about that later. But here, at left, you can kind of see the distribution of households by type. And, many of these folks have just one adult. They're elderly people living alone, account for nearly 1/3 of low-income households. Single parents account for another 13% or so. And these two groups have, generally high poverty rates, and they're considered more vulnerable to health risks from homes that are too hot or too cold. And for the elderly population in particular, there's a need a tendency to need more cooling and heating services to stay comfortable. And for a subset of folks, it's maybe not as large as at least I would have thought, but they want they're insistent upon a fairly high degree of energy reliability for medical equipment. So these folks who are 60 or older, you see, account for, about 1/3 of the households. And, this population is associated with higher rates of diabetes, heart problems, hypertension, and those rates go up very substantially when you get to age 75 and above. And these households also, tend to be associated, tend to have members who have some disability. Half of all low-income households that have a senior member have someone with a disability. Most common is a mobility disability. So from a program standpoint, this means a lot of eligible householders don't get around very well. They're going to be constrained from kind of coming out and supplying income qualification paperwork. And, the age profile also suggests that maybe marketing through social media, this is, 1/3 of your target population that may where social media may not get quite as much traction as, say, word of mouth. I want to look very briefly at income. At right, you can see the primary source of income for households. The largest share is being wages, second largest being Social Security or some other form of retirement income. Public assistance is a primary income source for a relatively small percentage, about 6%. So there are some efficiencies to be gained there because we're going to talk about it a little bit more, but you can do categorical qualifications. When folks are kind of applying for the supplemental nutrition program or for Medicaid, oftentimes social service agencies or community action agencies can also kind of sign them up for weatherizations. But again, this turns out to be a relatively small share of the overall low-income overall low-income households. So really briefly, I also want to point out that a very large share of households, particularly at the lowest end of the income spectrum, have dependents, most commonly children, but also some elderly. This particular graph is just for California, and you can see kind of that at the lowest income level, lowest income cohort, you've got, fully 71% of households have dependents. And in general, this translates into more energy demand, certainly more demands on income, and that translates into a higher energy burden and lower energy security, which could be read as a more substantial motivation to save energy or have on-site generation. So, I want to draw some distinctions here between low and moderate income, the housing stock for low and moderate income, and you'll see that there are some similarities in some respects. In general, both income cohorts live in older, leakier homes. Here we've chosen to kind of identify those as pre-1970s structures before a number of residential building energy codes come into play. These older dwellings tend to have more structural problems, leaky roofs, poor insulation. They have can have some safety and health issues with mold or asbestos in the attic or knob and tube or other antiquated wiring, ventilation around sources of carbon monoxide. On average, when people go out into the field and try to do retrofits, on average, nearly 1 in 5 housing units is rejected due to the presence of these health, safety, or structural issues. And so, unfortunately, it's these homes and those with somewhat less severe problems of the same type for the moderate income households. They account for a disproportionately large share of consumption for those households and for all households in aggregate. And so the take home here is that the biggest opportunities for efficiency, at least, are in these homes that can be difficult to serve because of the need for some additional investments in order to enable the efficiency improvements. I guess I would suggest that some of that dynamic also holds in the renewable case. So this is one way in which we do see some divergence between low-income households and the housing stock for and tenor for low-income households and moderate-income households. And what you see is a very substantially greater number of renters and folks living in multifamily among the low-income households than you do in the moderate-income market. Why do we care about renters versus owners? These are really, and multifamily versus single family, these are really fundamentally different markets with different actors, different decision makers, and different motivations, and often different end uses. On the multifamily side, you're often really looking at end uses that have greater similarity to the commercial building market. I also want to note, I took a look at this data recently, but also some years ago, and even though the recession's over, the share of renters, of leasing here of renters has actually continued to increase. It increased over the course of the recession, and it's continued decline. We've seen, particularly in the moderate income population, we've seen kind of the share of renters go from 33% up to 41% of those households, and ownership decline from 67% to 59%. Actually, just another note here is, we also see that there's some divergence here in where you tend to find the highest concentrations of low income and moderate income households. Moderate income households you tend to find more out in the suburbs, somewhat in urban areas, but that's, low income households are more concentrated in urban areas and more remote rural areas. And the opportunities for energy savings tend to be, when you look at the consumption profile, tend to be greater on the heating and air conditioning side for low-income households and increasingly are on the plug load side for moderate income households. We're going to talk very briefly here about energy burden. On average, U.S. households at large spend 3% of their income on energy. Looking across all low and moderate income households, you're looking more at 6.8%. And just to give that some perspective, this is about half, it seems small, but this is about half of average household spending on food or rent. And as you work your way down through the income cohorts, now this particular chart, again, just comes from California, and you can see the rather dramatic ramp up in energy burden. Here, I've kind of neglected to explain that that's what you're spending on energy as a share of gross pre-tax income. And so you can see that for some of the lowest income households, that share can be really dramatic. And there is high motivation for energy rationing, conservation behavior, it can be motivation to invest in energy efficiency. So, let's turn to how, various entities have tried to address energy efficiency among low-income households. The primary thrust of those efforts is in the single-family market with weatherizations. These are, where you're tending to do income qualification and implementation of the retrofits by a community action agency or a contractor for a utility, sometimes a state agency. They usually start with income qualification, then an energy audit that identifies and prioritizes end uses where there's some waste. And then the contractor schedules a retrofit with the householder. And the typical measures are lighting, there's some air sealing, insulation, maybe duct sealing, insulation wrap for water heaters, maybe some door and envelope repairs, windows. And then either tune-ups or replacement for HVAC systems or an evaporative cooler if you're in those parts of the country. Next, in the single-family market, we do see a fair amount of distribution of direct install kits. These can range from just light bulbs on up to a packet of measures. That's fairly common where you have either a contractor installing those directly or the householder is assumed to. So there's lighting, there's faucet aerators, low flow shower heads, weather stripping. And in both cases, with weatherization and direct install, there's usually some element of energy education on maintaining the measures and, maybe some tips on conservation. Multifamily, that market, as I mentioned, is rather different. You're kind of selling often to the owner or manager of the building. Measures typically address common areas, lighting, and tune-up or more frequently replacement of major HVAC systems. These are often replacing 40, 50-year boilers that are in the basement of large apartment buildings. Sometimes it includes individual units and appliance swap outs. And sometimes that, model is applied particularly in public housing complexes. And so, I'm not going to cover all these. There are a lot of challenges to working in this market. It's difficult. There are, issues of awareness that may be, more so than you would tend to find with higher income households. And, these services are generally delivered at no cost, but that, that doesn't translate into a willingness to do them. And for a variety of reasons, much of which has to do with the transaction costs for the household and the inconvenience of having multiple visits to the home in order to implement the changes, to identify what needs to be done, to do it, and then to do inspections after the fact. In many cases, householders just can't afford or they're otherwise just unable to take the time off of work for income verification, to meet the contractor for the retrofit, and an inspector to kind of look over the work after the fact. For a lot of households, there's a distrust factor. There's, a wariness of accepting free services. I think people think, well, maybe I'm just going to be charged later. And there can be also a reluctance to accept those free services, partly as often as a matter of pride. I know in Appalachia, where I've worked for a number of years, people simply don't want to tell others anybody else what they make, what their income is, and they don't want to take a handout, or what they'll see as a handout. In the multifamily context, or for renters, there's often a misalignment of tenant versus landlord interest on energy bills. The landlord is not really exposed in many cases to those costs, and so and in many cases, householders are worried about asking for improvements for fear that their lease is going to go, that their rent is going to go up. Again, as we talked about, there's some poor condition issues, and the work is generally expensive. So, within the among low-income households, there's some particularly difficult segments. We kind of talked about renters in the multifamily setting. Rural households can be hard to reach cost effectively. Contractors, it's easier to get economies of scale in an urban environment. Foreign language only households, I guess, I don't have to dwell here very much, but, sometimes, a household will get a phone call from someone soliciting, interest, and just hang up when they hear English. But there are, many ways of addressing these issues. They include the obvious stuff of having, materials printed in multiple languages, of having, graphics-intensive kinds of flipboards, and making presentations in neighborhoods and through community-based organizations. But it's also very much an issue of kind of gaining trust within the community and working through community leaders and often religious leaders. And there also are significant issues for undocumented immigrants for a number of reasons that are both obvious and not obvious. There's some fear about accepting services and being perceived as not contributing to society or being considered people who are in need. People are afraid that their lack of documentation or their status is going to be revealed. And for people who come from certain countries where there's a fair amount of unrest, there's a fear of letting people into the house, period. Seniors we've kind of talked about, and people with disabilities, you have these mobility issues, and perhaps, again, some diminution of the ability to reach those households through social media. So, some of the efforts to address some of these challenges is, a lot of implementers, a lot of these community action agencies that do the vast majority of low-income energy efficiency work around the country, they're allowed under federal funding to spend a certain share of the project funds on fixing some of these structural health and safety issues. There are, of course, limits to that. And they've also, gotten pretty good. Some community action agencies do, just extraordinary work on reaching out and getting lots of different sources of funding and kind of pancaking this and tapping into grant funds for addressing health issues and tapping foundations. And I would say that one of the models that's being tried out there, I think jury's still out on how well it works, is there's some interest now in pay for performance models where, a utility or other entity is kind of setting a cent per kilowatt hour price and buying all of the savings up to and at that price, kind of setting a bounty. And so community action agencies are kind of negotiating that price and trying to meet it. Again, what you often see is that these community action agencies have multiple objectives, and they often are prioritizing houses for just, retrofits to serve the elderly and folks who are disabled. One of the ways in which you can address some of the cost issues associated with low-income energy efficiency is by focusing on high energy burden, high use households. That doesn't have to necessarily come at the cost of those other objectives, but it can be blended in as yet another kind of criteria for prioritization. We talked a little bit about, particularly in the foreign language contest, working through trusted community partners. I guess that works in almost any context. There is, the most successful recruitment strategy out there is word of mouth, and so. Forming partnerships within various segments of those households really does work. We did talk a little bit about kind of geographic screening for income eligibility. It does have these, these risks of kind of constraining your opportunities, but if you're also doing qualifications at the individual household level to complement what you're doing kind of on a block by block basis or at an apartment complex basis, then you don't have those impacts. You don't have that reduction in energy savings as long as you're kind of doing both in a complementary fashion. Categorical qualification, people, using social service agencies or community action agencies is kind of one-stop shop for qualifying people for, multiple services to which they, that they may be eligible for, including weatherizations. And then, there's an effort also to kind of, ease the burden as much as possible on households for scheduling this stuff by putting it all online and where it can be seen by and used by householders and by contractors and by the program, and also helps kind of track projects and tell everybody kind of where things are. So we also see some new program models that are out there. Some of these have been evolving for a while. I would put in that category this first one that people are turning increasingly, and this is not just in the low-income space, but in the non-income qualified market. There's a recognition that the cost of doing a whole home for energy, those initial costs can be daunting. And so there's an effort to kind of, phase that work out over time and, not, kind of start off with some of the basics and then, work out kind of a timeline or a schedule for people to bite off more chunks of the overall project and, take on the larger price tag items, HVAC replacement, kind of at a time and place where they, really feel most comfortable doing that. This approach also works in the multifamily context by kind of working out a schedule with a building owner or manager where you're kind of going and you're doing buildings maybe, 1 or 2 a year across an entire complex, or or you're going measure by measure. So you're replacing maybe refrigerators 1 year and you're doing lighting the next year. And then, at some point you're getting to that older boiler that's in the basement. We've also seen an expansion of focus to plug loads to consumer electronics. People are really looking for savings outside of whole home retrofits. And there's an increasing emphasis also on looking at mobile and manufactured homes, of doing qualifications for, whole neighborhoods and clusters of those, and going in and doing fairly efficient direct install retrofits and sometimes replacements for mobile homes in particular. We're also seeing some investigation of again, kind of novel delivery and recruitment channels of kind of working through food banks or churches, getting things directly into households' hands when they're coming for multiple services at a time. And there's been a tendency in the past to really focus on the public housing market. I think people are turning increasingly to looking at the private subsidized housing market, where often in public housing you don't have much. You can have households not really exposed to energy cost, and you do have that exposure for subsidized housing, and so people tend to be a little more motivated to take on weatherizations. And so let's see. I did want to mention one example. This is a combination of energy efficiency and solar water heating. In Hawaii, they've been doing this for a very long time, 30 years. They do give priority to households where they're that have members who are elderly or disabled. They have a list of qualified certified contractors. The measures include solar water heating, room air conditioning units, fridge replacements, lighting, low flow shower heads. A number of different measures that work well in that climate and housing types. There's an effort to really do very accessible kind of marketing where you're really communicating savings in terms of everyday goods, right? A certain amount of food or clothing or what have you. On average, that program spending $7K a project. And I think, as you'll hear probably from my colleague Greg Levenis next week, that program is increasingly shifting to some low interest loans to kind of help those projects and maybe take on even larger project sizes. Lately the market penetration has been fairly small, but they have a fairly sizable market saturation from all of those years of doing this, particularly in the homelands where Native Hawaiians have drawn a fair amount of prioritization from the program. So in summary, low and moderate income households, they're similar in some ways we talked about, and they're different in others. You have a much higher proportion of single parent or single adult households, large share of dependents, and again, disproportionate share of households with members who are elderly or disabled. And we talked a little bit about kind of the differences in ownership versus renting, and that, as Greg will get into next week, has some real implications in terms of access to capital, equity and access to capital. There are these long-established approaches, but again, these are pretty tough markets to crack. The poor quality of housing, distrust issues, work conflicts, the split incentives. It is, the market penetration for most of these programs is kind of in the 2 to 4 or 5% range per year. There are some of these new approaches. They're aimed at kind of streamlining the qualification process, expanding the number of markets to which folks are looking for savings, looking at a larger array of delivery mechanisms, and then also, particularly in the Hawaii case, some combination of energy efficiency with customer-sided renewables. And so I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to the moderator for Q&A.
Hey, thanks very much, Ian. That you covered a lot of ground there and gave people a lot of useful background information. I'm going to run through various questions I received. And the first one is, what is the source of the housing stock data that you were quoting for the low and moderate income housing stock?
Yeah, so that data actually comes from a couple of different places. I tend to where we're looking, for example, at the age of housing and how that's related to consumption. We're principally looking at the residential energy consumption survey that the Energy Information Administration puts out. So, where you want to kind of see the coincidence of different housing types or tenure with consumption levels, that's where I would tend to turn. But, for overall data that on relating up income with housing, we tend to turn more to the housing survey that the Census Bureau does. Much larger sample size, coverage of all states and metropolitan areas.
Okay. Well, leaving aside the data specifically on housing stock, you presented a fair amount of LMI demographic data. And is that data available at the state or the metropolitan area level?
Yeah, even better. I mean, you can get pumps as public, let's see, what do they call it? Public use microdata. You can, so that is the actual survey data. It's, stripped of identifiers. You can get those files that are particularly in a whole package that is SAS friendly. It's not really available for other types of statistical packages, but it has the weightings as one of the files that you get. And you can also, there are a number of tools that allow you to kind of do these pivot tables and cross tabs between income at pretty well, pretty finely resolved income cohorts and the type of housing and these kind of some of these other issues on race or ethnicity. Yeah, it's I think my favorite on that score where you're looking at demographics in particular is the American Community Survey for the census, and it's fairly frequent. I think it's every 2 years.
Good. You compared three big groups: low-income households, moderate income, and upper income households in several different ways. Somebody's written in to ask two other comparisons. Do you have any data as to whether low-income people tend to move more or less frequently than moderate income and upper income folks?
Well, I guess I mentioned you tend to find more concentrations of lower income households in urban areas. I'm not sure that quite answers the question, but
this person was getting at the issue of persistence in the same house or apartment, whether people are moving between houses and apartments frequently or not.
That's a very good question, and I'm sorry I don't have any data on that score, but I think that's worth looking at, and I would suggest to you that there are probably marked differences in the level of mobility between the renting portion of low-income households and the folks who own their own house. There's a fair amount of tendency to stay in the same house for a long time if you own it, but a fair amount of mobility in the population that is leasing their dwellings.
Good. And do you have any data on the likelihood of somebody being at home during the day in a low-income household?
I don't have that data, but it is available, I think, mostly in the American Community Survey. And even, a fair amount of information on who's there, right? Is it, is it somebody who's really elderly, or is it someone who might plausibly be a decision maker about improvements to a home? I think that data is there, and I don't want to be held to it, but there is definitely data on whether somebody's tends to be home during work hours.
Okay, great. Let's switch away from the data and look towards programs. Have you heard of any do-it-yourself or sweat equity models, especially with training provided for installing larger energy efficiency measures, things like heat pump water heaters?
Yes is the short answer. I guess I would say that the history of those is mixed. I guess when you look at the numbers, when you look at the amount of do-it-yourself work that's going on nationally, I don't have those numbers at my fingertips, but it's massive. I mean, there is a huge amount of investment going on at all income levels. And it's often just part of the house. It's bedrooms, it's kitchens, it's everything that you would, bathrooms occasionally. It's what you would think, is going on. And sometimes that stuff dovetails with energy efficiency, and in many cases it doesn't. There are some programs out there that, they try to train up people and allow them to do-it-yourself installations of insulation. I don't know of many that do major system installations. In fact, none come to mind right now. But I would be hard pressed off the cuff to come up with a program that's shown demonstrated success over a long period of time. Usually they have fairly rigorous training and inspection requirements, and the cost of those can, kind of erase what savings you think you would tend to get. So I guess I would say that it's a mixed record, and I'd love to see some more experimentation out on it, but there are not a lot of examples.
Okay. Will you please describe the implementation model where you talked about using a cap share project cost for fixing structural health and safety issues? Can you say a bit more about that? You started to provide some detail, but this person is curious to learn a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, usually, when folks are going out and they're doing an energy audit and they're identifying energy efficiency measures that might be, taken or installed, they're doing a cost effectiveness calculation called an SIR. It's a savings to investment ratio. And a lot of these implementers are allowed to exclude a certain share of project costs from the SIR. So, the SIR is based upon, what you're saving in terms of the monetized value of the energy savings. And so, in order to get those savings, sometimes you have to shore up windows. You have to fix that hole in the roof. You have to, it doesn't make any sense to put insulation in there if you've got, a hole in the roof or something that's structurally unsound, if you've got, big holes in the door, or, gaps in the wall. And so as long as those things are, something you can address with, $1,000, $1,200, maybe $1,500, there are a number of places that do that, but it's capped.
Okay. What are the best pathways for identifying strong community partners or utilities that are interested in addressing LMI energy poverty? Now, this person wrote in and is especially interested in rural issues, but if you have thoughts that go beyond rural as to how a group that's interested in energy efficiency and solar energy would find community partners either in the rural or in the urban setting.
Yeah. So, there's a temptation to say you'll go and try and find it wherever you can, but usually, it's very essential to try and identify those organizations, and usually there are pretty clear organizations in foreign language only communities. Oftentimes, I'm out here in California, and you go into neighborhoods where there are a lot of Chinese, Mandarin only speakers, or only speaking Japanese or Korean, and usually there is a pretty clear partner that is really engaged in doing a lot of events, where people are kind of helping one another with literacy, with applications for social services. It's not too hard to ask around and find out who those folks are. Out in the rural areas, it's these community action agencies and churches. As long as you can kind of partner up with those guys, that's a natural entry point.
Good. And how about the best way to reach fixed income elderly populations? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I would guess I would say that there's this, the elderly populations have, their own safety nets. Again, that's often faith-based and, based around, senior centers. And, there are, these pretty obvious kinds of places, but I don't have good information for you. And the community action agencies also really try and keep a handle on, who's vulnerable, who's older and vulnerable out there. And they're usually pretty knowledgeable within their specific communities on, who really needs the care and who they really want to look out for most. And so that's where I would tend to direct attention. How successful those efforts are in particularly in urban setting with folks who are not especially mobile, not getting out of the house much, I don't have any information on that.
Okay, well, we have 3 minutes left, and there was a range of questions that I'm going to ask you to address in a second. I want to tell people on the line, the slides will be up on the CISA website after the webinar, along with the recording. And several people wrote in questions that have to do with financing. We're going to be addressing that topic explicitly in next week's webinar. So we'll get to those sorts of questions then. But a number of people had questions related to your data sources again, and some of it went by pretty fast. And so if you could explain what are the key data sources that are out there for information about the low and moderate income households, the key data sources you used, and where do people get them?
Yeah, no, I'll first say, when folks look at the slides, you'll find my contact information now at the very end, and I'm all too happy to kind of wade into whatever level of detail you want on identifying these sources, and even kind of maybe we'll walk you through kind of how to access them. But I would say, again, when it comes to relating folks up with the dimension of income, the finest resolution data is Census Bureau data. It's American Community Survey. I in particular like the multi-year data because it's a much larger sample size, and because of that larger sample size, you're able to really drill down to almost any geographic level you want, down to the census block group. So, we're talking about, neighborhoods of a size of, maybe, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people. That's about the finest resolution you'll find in that data. Some township data, may be available at a finer resolution, but just on a very selective basis. And again, I think the REX data, the Residential Energy Consumption Survey data that EIA puts out is indispensable, particularly when you're kind of trying to figure out kind of where pockets of high consumption coincide with lower income. They do have, this stuff related up by income. And that data also is available as microdata, right? You can see the actual survey results, and those survey results are uniquely coupled with actual billings, right? When someone is surveyed, they have to sign a form that a release that allows their utility to share their consumption and expenditure data. And so that information is really pretty solid. Much smaller sample size, though, on characterizations of housing, of race and ethnicity, and other non-energy related stuff. And so, yeah, I guess if you have a statistician around, would really encourage them to kind of plumb into the public use microdata for those three data sets: the American Community Survey, American Housing Survey, and then the REX data at EIA.
Hey, that's great. So, Ian, thank you very much. You've given us a really good overall picture of the lay of the land. We'll hear more about financing and programs for low-income households next week. And I'm sure there'll be some people who will follow up with you individually. So thanks for taking the time with us today.
Delighted.
Bye, folks.